Was life a relentless cycle of mud, manure, and muttered prayers in medieval England? Did the scent of wood smoke and damp wool cling to every thread of existence, punctuated only by the terrifying rattle of the plague and the grim inevitability of a cart overturning? Let's dive into a world where a carpenter's wage was a distant dream, a loaf of bread a luxury, and survival was a daily, brutal negotiation. Forget knights and castles, this is the story of the forgotten millions, the backbone of England, the people who built, farmed, and toiled their way through a century of upheaval and unbelievable hardship. It began, predictably, with a bang, 1349, the Black Death. Suddenly, the population, already straining under the weight of cramped villages and meager harvests, began to vanish. Whole villages emptied, fields lay fallow, and the demand for labor exploded. Carpenters, once twice the pay of a simple laborer, found themselves competing for scraps. It wasn't a glorious victory, it was a chaotic scramble, a desperate ballet of survival. Wages doubled, then tripled, well, they didn't quite return to normal. The old proportions, gone, vanished like the plague itself. By the 15th century, a carpenter's wages were a quarter more than a laborer's. A sobering thought, isn't it? A master craftsman earning a little more than a field hand, a testament to a world utterly skewed by catastrophe. Let's meet Simon of Langnau, a man whose life revolved around the pungent aroma of cow dung and the quiet rhythm of milking. He wasn't a knight, not even a particularly ambitious farmer. He was a cottager and clerk of the chapel, a title that described a life of quiet servitude, tending the priory's cows and keeping the books. He lived in a small cottage, likely shared with his family, and his existence was a slow, steady drip of sustenance. A meal, a place to sleep on the barn floor, perhaps a handful of wheat. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life of survival, and it wasn't unique. Thousands like Simon dotted the landscape, their days dictated by the seasons and the whims of their employers. Then there were the hired hands, the seasonal workers who flocked to the fields during harvest. Imagine the scene, fields stretching to the horizon, a relentless sun beating down, and a desperate race to gather the bounty before it rotted. The demand for labor was so fierce that skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths abandoned their tools and joined the throngs, eager for a few extra shillings. It was a temporary alliance, a pragmatic response to a crisis, but it revealed a surprising fluidity in the medieval economy. These weren't just farmers, they were the skilled artisans who kept the wheels of society turning, even if only for a few precious weeks. But let's talk about the real labor, the backbreaking work that sustained the vast majority. Picture this, a man perhaps 40 years old, hired for the year by a manor bailiff. He's a plowman tasked with turning the soil, a carter hauling goods along dusty roads, or a stableman tending to the horses. These weren't glamorous jobs, they were dirty, demanding, and often dangerous. And they paid in food and occasionally a little money. Sleeping on the premises was a perk, a small comfort in a world of scarcity. These men, often married with families, weren't young apprentices, they were seasoned workers, accustomed to the rhythms of rural life. Let's meet Arnold of Tyringham, a man who spent January afternoons standing in a field, waving his arms to attract attention. He was a pauper, a man without a guaranteed income, relying on whatever work he could find. He wasn't looking for a grand position, he was simply trying to survive, his best bet. Carting manure, a monotonous, grueling task, but it was something, and his wife. She was the one who found him beneath the overturned cart, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their existence. It wasn't a romantic tale, it was a snapshot of daily reality. Now let's consider the sheer risk involved in these jobs. The countryside wasn't a haven of tranquility, it was a landscape of constant danger. Let's talk about mills. These were the engines of the medieval economy, grinding grain into flour, sawing timber into planks. But they were also death traps. Millers, caught up in the whirling sails of windmills, fell to their deaths. Repairing the mills meant climbing precarious ladders, risking a fatal plunge, and the water itself. Mill ponds were notorious for drowning unsuspecting workers. The millers, despite the inherent dangers, were vital to the community, and their pay reflected their importance, a testament to the brutal logic of medieval economics. And then there were the carts. Imagine hauling heavy loads across bumpy roads, often with overworked animals. It was a recipe for disaster. According to statistics, 43% of men's fatal accidents involved carting. A broken shaft, an overturned cart, a careless step, any of these could be fatal. Robert of Swinarton, charioteer to the Prior of St. John, learned this lesson the hard way. A broken shaft, a tumbling carriage, and a life cut short. It wasn't a heroic death, it was a tragic consequence of a dangerous occupation, but the dangers didn't end with carts. Let's consider boating. In areas with water, punting and sailing became alternative forms of transportation. Imagine a man 40 years old attempting to maneuver his boat on a river, only to become entangled in his pole, sliding helplessly towards the depths. A classic accident, a grim reminder of the unpredictable nature of the waterways and larger vessels on the Humber. Swept off by sails, crushed by rudder handles, drowned in storms, the risks were ever present. And what about the small, entrepreneurial endeavors? Alehouses run by men, offering a cold drink and a brief respite from the toil. Market stalls selling everything from cheese to beer, operated by both men and women. William, son of Nicholas Carter, epitomized this spirit of self-reliance. He ran a market stall supplying beer, cheese, and utensils, and he wasn't afraid to sue anyone who dared to damage his livelihood. It wasn't a life of leisure, it was a constant struggle for survival, but it was a struggle fueled by ingenuity and determination. Let's not forget the less glamorous but equally vital occupations. Fishing, poaching, and even bell ringing all offered supplemental income, a way to supplement the meager wages earned from agricultural labor. Boys fished with lines, men used nets and weirs, and the forests were patrolled by poachers, stealing game to feed their families. John Ball of Pinchbeck, using a fish weir, skillfully trapped fish in a ditch, a testament to the resourcefulness of the rural population. Then there were the craftsmen, tinkers, carpenters, potters, blacksmiths, providing essential goods and services to the surrounding villages. Pottery was a particularly important trade, producing everything from cooking pots to roof tiles. Bricks, a relatively new innovation, began to replace wattle and daub, offering a more durable building material. But even these skilled trades weren't without their dangers. Pottery involved digging clay from pits, a task that could result in cave-ins. Construction, too, was a hazardous profession, with workers falling from scaffolding, getting trapped in timber, or injured while quarrying stone. And what about tanning and leatherworking? Preparing hides for tanning was a laborious process, involving soaking, stretching, and treating the hides with chemicals. A Lincolnshire man, transporting hides to the sea for washing, lost his cart and his life to the waves, a tragic reminder of the unpredictable nature of the coastline. As the 14th century drew to a close, a shift began to occur. Cloth production, once largely confined to women's homes, started to move to the countryside. Men dominated the industry, dyeing lengths of cloth in large vats of boiling water. Dyers, apprentices, and even entire families risked being scalded by the scalding liquid. Finally, let's consider the mining industry, a regional specialty in Cornwall and the north of England. Almost all tenants in the tin-producing region were involved in mining, even if it was simply subleasing small parcels of land. Some tenants amassed considerable fortunes, acting as middlemen in the industry. But mining was a dangerous occupation, with workers risking cave-ins, explosions, and disease. But it wasn't just about survival, it was about accumulating wealth, however meager. Peasants, driven by necessity, diversified their income streams. They rented out their land, invested in livestock, and even engaged in speculative ventures, lending money to their neighbors. The wealthy peasants, like the Blois in Cornwall, invested in land, livestock, and even mills, seeking to maximize their returns. The poor, like the Bate family in Riddle, Essex, relied on loans and the labor of their tenants, creating a cycle of debt and dependence. The story of the medieval peasant wasn't one of heroic deeds or grand ambitions. It was a story of relentless toil, constant risk, and unwavering determination. It was a story of survival, of adaptation, and of a remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. It's a story often overlooked, a story of millions who built the foundations of England, brick by painstaking brick, harvest by grueling harvest. And now the question remains, was this a life worth living? A life defined by scarcity, danger, and unrelenting labor? Or was it, in its own way, a testament to the enduring human spirit, a story of people who faced adversity with courage, ingenuity, and an unwavering belief in their ability to survive?